Prime Minister Kurti, thank you so much for giving this interview to Arab News. It's a pleasure to be in your country in this first ever interview with the Saudi media.
Thank you very much for having me. Welcome to Kosovo. And on this occasion, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on the founding day, to congratulate all your viewers, and in particular, the King and the Crown Prince.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. If you would allow me, I'll jump straight into the topic of the hour. It wasn't on my agenda, but this is the nature of the news cycle. Russia and Ukraine, which is right next door to your country. What's your reading about the situation? Do you fear the worst is going to happen and we're going to see a war very soon between these two countries?
We are not afraid, but we should be very careful. Because in Moscow we have an autocratic leader who is both angry and nostalgic. After disintegration of Soviet Union, we have Russian Federation with tentacles in the neighborhood. Belarus, then Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine, then Transnistria and Gagauzia in Moldova, till South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. And I think that creation of these satellite parastates in the neighborhood of Russian Federation is a danger to EU, to Europe. And it is also linked with the situation in the Balkans. Because in Balkans we have our northern neighbor, Serbia, which has close cultural, historical, and military links with Moscow. So we are following the situation very carefully, but we are not afraid.
Are there any precautions you're taking? If this spills over, there might be a refugee crisis on your border. It might make you lose the economic points that you gained throughout the last year. And we're going to talk about that later, but it will have an impact on the economy, on the refugees. Are you worried about that? Are you worried that might it trigger Serbia to become maybe more aggressive towards your country?
We count that Serbia might become more aggressive. Because in 2012, a decade ago, they had only 2 joint military exercises with Russian Federation. In 2016, they had 50, and last year they had 100 joint military exercises with Russian Federation. Gazprom owns 56% of Serbian oil industry. And likewise, it owns majority of shares in biggest Southeast European gas storage in Banatski Dvor in Serbia. And Serbia is buying military equipment from Russian Federation and from Belarus, including some donations that it is getting from them. So we are following the situation carefully. We want to join NATO. We are still not members of NATO, but whereas we are not in NATO, it is NATO which is in Kosovo. And our security and defense, we always harmonize and synchronize with NATO.
Allow me to be a little bit controversial on that point in particular in NATO. In a world where we're seeing the American administration, at least this one, repeatedly saying they want to put an end to endless wars. We saw what happened in Afghanistan and the dreadful images of Afghanis capturing the plane and trying to escape. Is there no concern that your biggest ally, the United States, might not be that reliable? It might turn its back on Kosovo, that the ambition to join NATO or the EU might never be achieved?
I don't think that will be the case. We have received over 1,400 Afghan refugees because we consider that to be a humanitarian issue. We consider that as an obligation as human beings to host people who are in grave need. Around 300 are still in Kosovo, the others left for other Western countries. But at the same time, we are also increasing trainings, equipment, and personnel for our security forces of Kosovo. And in this way, we are also increasing our defense capacities. Last year, from March to June, we participated in Defender Europe 21, which is the biggest military enterprise of NATO. And we also participated in co-deployment with US Army in Kuwait. And we are contributing to global security. So in one hand, we want to strengthen ourselves to be a more reliable partnership with the United States. But on the other hand, we think that NATO is here to stay. And the situation of US withdrawal from Afghanistan cannot be compared with any other situation.
But here's maybe another comparable situation, Crimea. And we remember it was President Obama, red line, do not cross the red line. Crimea happened and neither the US or NATO could have done anything. I'm only asking because it's a clear and present danger with the situation that we just spoke about. If the worst happens, is Kosovo able to defend itself?
I think that Kosovo has great people with great will and courage on one hand, and on the other hand, I think that our defense and security forces and NATO, especially US, are here to stay, and we are certain that we will be victorious in any kind of future crisis which might occur, but which we do not want to happen.
Let us talk a little bit about the diplomatic avenue. I know in your campaign agenda, the negotiations with Serbia weren't on top of the list. But as it's still in the standstill that it is now, neither country wins. So neither country can join the EU. And there is a problem of recognition. Do you think in the coming months, especially with the changing geopolitics of the region, the negotiations with Serbia might become a higher priority for your country?
A year ago, we won on a ticket of jobs and justice, employment for people, especially for youth and women, and on the other hand, justice, anti-corruption, fairness of the institutions is something that we pledge to the people, and people have high expectations from us. Of course, pandemic COVID-19 imposed itself as a priority, and we did quite well. At present, over 2/3 of the population who are above 16 years old, they've gotten 2 doses of vaccines against COVID-19 virus, and in addition, they are getting the 3rd dose more and more each day. So we did not want to neglect dialogue with Serbia, but I cannot have it as priority number 1. I said from the onset of this government that jobs, justice, and pandemic COVID-19 are the top 3 priorities. Number 4 could be the dialogue there as well. This dialogue, to which we are approaching in a constructive and creative manner with different proposals, is dialogue about the status of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. Kosovo and Serbia do not recognize each other. So the solution is mutual recognition. And we need normalization of relations, but at the same time, we need normalization of Kosovo. We need normalization of Serbia. In Kosovo, you have high level of democracy. And not only that, Kosovo has political stability. And Kosovo is having a great economic growth of 9.9%. So we have this problem with Serbia, but at the same time, we are having a state building of our country, and we are progressing in socio-economic processes. Therefore, dialogue with Serbia should end with full normalization, where the centerpiece is mutual recognition. So normalization is not only recognition, but it has no meaning without recognition.
But Obviously, if there is recognition and you both join the EU, this will create obviously more jobs and more opportunities and will solve a lot of problems. What's the status at the moment with Serbia? Because from all what we've been reading, it's reached a standstill for the past few months.
In autumn last year, we achieved an agreement regarding reciprocity on car plates. So car plates which come from Serbia and those who go to Serbia from Kosovo are now arranged in reciprocal manner. Before that, we had only cars from Serbia coming to Kosovo without paying anything, whereas we had to pay €5 for temporary car plates. And now there are stickers over state symbols, and this has been arranged in Brussels. And no one has to pay when going to Serbia. So there are some small steps, but again, what we need is a legally binding agreement for full normalization with mutual recognition in the center. Sooner we reach this, better for both Kosovo and Serbia. I think it's going to be very positive for Serbia once Serbia recognizes Kosovo. So it's not only Kosovo which benefits, Serbia will benefit as well, because they are not able to join EU without recognizing independent Republic of Kosovo.
Do you think Kosovo joining NATO is more likely to happen quicker than joining EU?
I believe that this is the case for two reasons. First, in EU we have 5 non-recognizers out of 27, whereas in NATO we have 4 non-recognizers out of 30. So one non-recognizer less in NATO than in EU, but in addition, the criteria and standards that you have to fulfill to join NATO are not as complex as they are for joining EU. So it is realistically to expect that we will first join NATO and then EU.
As a major non-ally, what classification would you be joining, or are you applying to join NATO?
Well,
full member?
We want to be full member of NATO because we believe that NATO is a great defense and security umbrella of Europe as continent and of EU as main project of peace and prosperity since the Second World War.
Right. Your Excellency, you mentioned non-recognizers, and obviously you've had your issues with some of your neighbors in Europe, but Kosovo is a majority Muslim country. What's the sentiment towards Muslim countries that don't recognize Kosovo, for example, Iran?
Well, we think that it's a big mistake that some of the countries with a Muslim majority population are not recognizing Kosovo. I think that they have been misinformed by Serbia, and some of them do this because they keep some close links with the Russian Federation. However, I would urge all the countries in the world, for the sake of long-term peace, sustainable security, and recognizing the right of people to freedom and self-determination, to recognize independence of Kosovo. In a way, those who do not recognize independence of Kosovo, with or without intention, they fall prey to supporting Serbia from the time of Milosevic, who committed genocide in Kosovo. So they should distance themselves from Serbia, which wanted to exterminate Albanian people from Kosovo.
You say that, Prime Minister. One interesting case is the Palestinian Authority. From what you're saying, they should be the first to recognize Kosovo and stand with you. My understanding is they're also not recognizing Kosovo, and they had very close relations with Milosevic at the time. What's the sentiment towards people who are currently facing illegal occupation themselves, not supporting a country like Kosovo?
I think that it is very important for Palestinian Authority, for Palestinian people, to also acknowledge and recognize the suffering of the Albanians in Kosovo, and to see independence of Kosovo as an expression of our self-determination. And sooner they do this, I think better will be for our relations. We think that Palestinian people suffered a lot in the past, and I would think of a peaceful coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis. And I think that having in mind that Serbia today is the Yugoslavia of yesterday, and neglecting that Kosovo was occupied by both Serbia and Yugoslavia does not give the right picture of the reality, which we do not have to find in history books. We all lived through it. So I think that just as we know how much Palestinian people suffered, they should not neglect the suffering of the Albanians in Kosovo who survived Serbia's genocide.
Was the Palestinian position, just to distinguish, the Palestinian leadership position regarding Kosovo a factor in the Trump-era deal, which saw Israel recognize Kosovo, but Kosovo recognize controversially Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? Was it more related to the Palestinian position, or was it just part of the Trump broker deal?
Well, former U.S. president came to power like 5 years ago, whereas we declared independence 14 years ago. So there was enough time to see that Kosovo is being recognized more and more by different countries throughout the world. And it's never too late. I think they can change their mind now in accordance to our historical reality and to current democratic government of Kosovo. I remember very well when NATO intervened against Yugoslavia, which was led by Milosevic. Both Palestinians and Israelis supported people of Kosovo. So I think they should also nowadays both support independence of Kosovo.
But the decision to recognize Jerusalem was not a way to punish or to retaliate on the Palestinians.
That has nothing to do with our stance towards Palestinian people and their cause. We want to have good relations with Palestine, with Palestinian Authority, and with Palestinians as people.
Your Excellency, last year, Kosovo rightly designated Hezbollah as a terrorist group, which was something applauded in moderate Arab and Muslim countries and also in Western countries. Can you tell us more about the background of that decision and what led Kosovo to, because many countries in the world didn't reach that realization?
It is not difficult to recognize terrorism and violent extremism. So in line with our beliefs and values on which we are building our country and on which we are orienting future generations, we made such a decision in Kosovo, and we are part of the global coalition against violent extremism and terrorism. So we also condemned all the attacks and activities of Hezbollah, but also of Daesh, ISIS. We think that it is our humane spirit, the respect for human dignity, which obliges us for such political stances against these extremists and terrorists.
Your Excellency, you just said it's not hard to recognize terrorism. The Houthis, a few weeks ago, bombed a civilian airport in Abu Dhabi, and they've been bombing civilian areas in my country, in Saudi Arabia, airport in Abha, capital city Riyadh, even close to Mecca. Do you share the same definition of terrorism in these circumstances?
Yes, we were appalled by these images and all these attacks, absurd violence against civilians, which has nothing to do with respect for human dignity, for human rights, for society and community, is something that we can never tolerate, and it is our task to always condemn.
So you agree that the Houthis should be designated as a terrorist group if they are attacking civilian?
Yes, I think that all these attacks on civilians are terrorist actions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So continuing with the talk about on terrorism, the Balkans and Kosovo in particular have been known to be exporting fighters to Daesh. Perhaps other countries as well in the Balkans, but we're talking about Kosovo in particular. As you know, Saudi Arabia leads an Islamic coalition against terrorism and has decades of experience in counter-extremism in terms of ideology, in financing, and in military operations. How do you rate the cooperation, intelligence sharing, and experience exchange between the two countries on this file in particular?
I think that we have good cooperation and we would like to continue it, because when we fight violent extremism and terrorism and all these kind of violent fundamentalisms, we are on the same page. There has been a couple of hundred of people from Kosovo who unfortunately joined these absurd wars, but some of them never came back. And for those who came back, we have done some rehabilitation programs, but some are also serving their sentences in prison. There has been some manipulation to certain individuals. I can imagine due to their lack of educational background, perhaps also unemployment and social misery. And we have to have a certain sensitivity towards this situation. However, this will never weaken us in harshly condemning violent extremism and terrorism.
There's been officials from your country who visited Saudi Arabia, including meeting the Minister of Islamic Affairs. As you know, we are going through a huge transformation in terms of religious reforms and social reforms in Saudi Arabia. And, what people would consider illogical, extremist things that used to happen no longer exist. For example, women now are allowed to drive, cinemas have opened. How much of this reforms is followed here in Kosovo, and how do you think it impacts Muslims in this country and the Muslim world in general?
It is followed, but not sufficiently. I think people of Kosovo, but also people in the Balkans and in Europe, should know more about the reforms and the progress in Saudi Arabia. We want to strengthen cooperation with Saudi Arabia. It's a very rich country, both in its culture and history, but likewise in its natural resources and economic development. With our government, we are fighting corruption. There is no tolerance for corruption. And we are also increasing our economy. For example, last year we have had for 2/3 higher exports than the year before. Exports of our goods. Budget revenues increased by 1/3. Likewise, increased business turnover, whereas foreign direct investment increased by over 50%. These data shows that Kosovo is progressing, and the best way for more progress is to invest in the already existing progress. And in ICT sector, information communication technology, in wood and metal processing, in agriculture, I believe that Republic of Kosovo and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can cooperate more and do more together.
That's a very good point, very interesting point, Your Excellency. And actually, when I was comparing your campaign mandate, it's very similar to what we have in Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince's Vision 2030. It's also, in a way, it's also about jobs and justice. As you know, we had a very strong campaign against corruption in Saudi Arabia. Maybe the additional element we have is diversifying away from oil. So I think would be very interesting to kind of compare notes about what I'd like to call courtinomics. So not every prime minister can come and take a country, according to what I've read, from -3% to +9% growth in 1 year. How do you do it?
Well, first is hope of the people. With us in power, people were hopeful. People were optimistic. They felt much more alive. And when people are hopeful, they rather spend than save. And our economy was growing. Because when you expect rainy days in the future, you rather save than spend. But in our case was the opposite for good. Then when people see that government is not corrupted, they are more ready to pay taxes and other contributions. That's why budget revenues in Kosovo, tax revenues, increased by 1/3 without changing fiscal policy. And the last thing is that tax administration started to have greater discipline than before. So fighting corruption and crime helps not only common values of the people, but also the health of the economy. On the other hand, our diaspora, which is huge, especially concentrated in German-speaking Europe, they sent even more remittances back home than before. We have also established a commercial court, and in this way we want to create good environment for business. Kosovo has euro as a currency, very young population, average age is 30 years, even though we are ancient people. And we are located at the heart of the Balkans, close with European markets. And at the same time, Kosovo is a country which never forgets its friends and wants to have good relations with all peace-loving nations in the world.
So one very important point for countries, at least from our part of the world, Saudi Arabia, for example, is what you mentioned about fighting corruption. It's very important for decision-making process. What guarantees can you offer investors, be it government or private sector, who want to come to Kosovo and invest? What are the opportunities that they can invest in, and how can they protect their environment? Because as you know, this is a very young country, so maybe people don't know much about it.
We don't tolerate corruption anywhere, but first of all within ourselves as institutions of the system. Corruption in Kosovo was high in the past, has not been eradicated altogether, but it was quite concentrated at the top. So there was no trickle-down effect. Corruption was concentrated at the top, and now we stopped it precisely on the top with the government change out of democratic elections. This is first point. Second point is that it is not enough not to be corrupted. You should be uncorruptible. So people must have faith in you that the present time is also future time, in the sense that you will continue not to be corrupted. And I think that our government, which is a cabinet of ministers which are well educated, good professionals, and people who do not want to get rich from politics, we say to all our friends and activists, whoever likes to get very rich, try your luck and skills in private sector. In public service of state institutions, you're supposed to serve. So serving is our vocation to best of our abilities and knowledge. And I think this is having good economic results as well. We would like to have more trade exchange with Saudi Arabia and more investments in health sector, in agriculture, also in energy, because we want, just like Saudi Arabia, to invest in renewables, especially solar and wind, because vast majority of our electrical energy is generated by coal thermal power plants. We would like to have more renewables, and I believe that together with information communication technology, wood and metal processing, these are some of the fields where we can cooperate with Saudi Arabia. And I, as a Prime Minister, look forward to get actively engaged in this.
Prime Minister, you've had quite a remarkable career, from political prisoner to where we are today, Prime Minister. You've had a successful run so far. Looking into the future, what would you like to be the legacy of your leadership for your country?
We are at the top of our region when it comes to managing pandemic COVID-19. I would like to see Kosovo progress further in terms of socioeconomic development, but also culture and also democratic administration of the country, and be among the best in the region. Hopefully, within a decade or so, as soon as possible, join first NATO and then EU as well.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.